Sir, even a billionaire can't buy a seat tonight. The words drifted across the marble entrance of the restaurant just loud enough for a few nearby guests to hear, and a couple of them glanced over their shoulders with curious smiles. Outside the tall glass doors, Manhattan glittered under the cold December sky, taxis sliding past like streaks of yellow light, and distant fireworks already whispering across the skyline as the city prepared for midnight. Inside, the restaurant glowed with warm amber light from chandeliers hanging above polished tables dressed in white linen and crystal glasses. Champagne bottles rested in silver buckets. Laughter moved through the room in waves. Every seat was filled. Every table had a name on it. And right near the hostess stand, standing slightly apart from the celebration, was Daniel Whitmore. 6'2", dark wool coat, tailored suit beneath it, the kind of quiet presence that usually caused doors to open before he even reached them. The founder and CEO of Whitmore Technologies. A man whose company employed over 12,000 people across the country. A man who could purchase a penthouse overlooking Central Park with the same casual ease most people use to buy a cup of coffee. But tonight none of that seemed to matter. The hostess, a young woman with a careful professional smile, checked her tablet again and shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, sir. Every table was reserved weeks ago. New Year's Eve is our busiest night." Daniel gave a small nod, polite, controlled, the way people did when they had spent a lifetime mastering composure in public spaces. His hand hovered near the back of an empty chair beside the entrance, but it wasn't truly empty. A small gold card sat on the table. Reserved. Around him conversations continued. A couple toasted with champagne. A group of friends counted down minutes until midnight, even though it was still hours away. No one meant to exclude him, not really. They were simply living their own celebrations. Daniel stepped slightly aside so the next arriving guests could approach the hostess stand, his reflection briefly appearing in the glass wall beside the entrance. From a distance, he looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, successful, composed, untouchable. But standing there with no table and nowhere to sit, he also looked strangely out of place, like a man who had arrived late to a party that had already chosen its guests. Across the room, near the back window overlooking the avenue, a much smaller table held a different kind of scene. The tablecloth there wasn't perfectly pressed, and the centerpiece candle leaned slightly to one side, but the two people sitting there didn't seem to notice. Marcus Reed sat with his shoulders slightly hunched inside a worn brown jacket that had clearly seen a few winters. Across from him, a boy about 8 years old leaned forward eagerly over a large pizza that had just been placed on the table. The boy's name was Jaden, and his laughter carried a kind of effortless brightness that didn't care about linen tablecloths or champagne towers. "Dad, this place is huge," Jaden whispered with wide eyes, watching a server walk past carrying a tray of sparkling glasses. Marcus smiled softly and slid a slice of pizza onto his son's plate. "Yeah," he said quietly, glancing around the elegant room as if still slightly surprised they had managed to get a table at all. Their reservation had been a last-minute cancellation, the hostess had explained. One of the smallest tables in the restaurant. But for Jaden, it might as well have been Times Square itself. As the boy took a bite and looked around again, his gaze drifted toward the entrance where Daniel Whitmore still stood alone near the host's stand. Jaden watched him for a moment, chewing thoughtfully, then tugged lightly at his father's sleeve. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice carrying the simple honesty children sometimes had when adults had forgotten how to say obvious things. Marcus looked down at him. "Yeah, buddy." Jaden nodded toward the entrance. "Why is that man eating by himself tonight?" Marcus followed his son's gaze across the glowing restaurant toward the tall figure standing near the door, and for a moment, he didn't answer. Marcus did not answer right away. He followed his son's gaze across the restaurant, watching the tall man near the entrance shift his weight slightly as another group of guests walked past him toward their reserved table. The chandeliers above reflected softly against the polished floor, and for a brief moment Daniel Whitmore looked less like the powerful executive the business magazines loved to photograph, and more like someone who had simply wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands loosely on the table. "Sometimes people end up alone on nights like this," he said quietly. Jaden tilted his head. "But it is New Year's Eve," the boy said with simple certainty, as if the holiday itself should have prevented that from happening. Marcus smiled faintly at the logic. Outside the window behind them, traffic lights changed from red to green, and a city bus rolled slowly past, its windows glowing against the winter night. The restaurant hummed with conversation, forks touching plates, glasses clinking softly, servers moving carefully between crowded tables. It was the kind of place Marcus had not visited in years. Not because he disliked restaurants like this, but because life had shifted in ways that made quiet nights with his son far more important than elegant dining rooms. He reached for his glass of water and took a small sip. The cold condensation gathered against his fingers. A few tables away, a group of coworkers raised their champagne glasses in a small toast and laughed loudly. Jaden watched them for a second before looking back toward the entrance again. "He still does not have a seat," the boy whispered. Marcus followed the glance again, noticing that the hostess had turned her attention to another arriving couple. Daniel Whitmore stood slightly to the side now, one hand resting near the pocket of his coat. He was not arguing. He was not demanding anything. He simply waited, as though hoping something might open up if he remained patient enough. Marcus recognized that kind of patience. He had learned it himself during the past few years. A patience that came from understanding that some things in life could not be rushed or forced. Jaden took another bite of pizza and then lowered his slice slowly. "Dad," he said again, softer this time, "does he have family?" Marcus considered the question. From where they sat, Daniel Whitmore looked like a man who had everything the world could offer. The suit, the confidence, the quiet authority in the way he stood. But Marcus had worked in enough offices years ago to know something many people forgot. Success did not always travel with companionship. Sometimes it moved faster, leaving people behind without warning. "I do not know," Marcus answered honestly. Jaden wiped his hands on a napkin and leaned closer to the table, his voice thoughtful. "Mom used to say something," the boy said slowly. Marcus felt a small pause in his chest at the mention of her, the memory arriving gently but clearly. "What did she say?" he asked. Jaden looked back toward the entrance again before answering. "She said that nobody should start a new year feeling invisible." The words hung quietly between them. Marcus did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched the man near the door again, noticing the subtle stillness in the way Daniel Whitmore stood while the entire restaurant moved around him like a celebration he had somehow missed. Marcus lowered his gaze to the table for a moment, thinking. Then he looked back at his son, who was still studying the stranger with open curiosity. The candle on their table flickered softly, casting small moving shadows across the pizza box and the simple glasses of water. Marcus exhaled slowly and leaned forward in his chair, his attention returning once more to the man waiting alone near the entrance. Marcus remained still for a moment, his eyes following the quiet figure near the entrance. The restaurant continued moving around him like a warm current of celebration. Servers carried trays filled with sparkling glasses. Someone near the bar laughed loudly. A group by the window began discussing where they would watch the midnight fireworks. Yet the tall man by the host stand seemed untouched by any of it, like a person standing outside the glass wall of a party. Marcus had seen that look before. Years earlier, he had stood in a similar position in a different kind of room, not a restaurant, but a corporate conference hall, where people in tailored suits discussed investments and quarterly reports. Back then, Marcus Reed had worn suits too. Clean pressed shirts, polished shoes. A security badge clipped neatly to his belt as he walked through the offices of an engineering firm in downtown Newark. Numbers, systems, designs, those had been the language of his days. He had been good at it too. Good enough that his supervisor once told him he would probably lead his own development team within a few years. Marcus reached for another slice of pizza but paused before lifting it, his mind briefly drifting through those memories. Life had taken a different turn since then. The hospital corridors, the quiet beeping machines, the long nights when his wife had grown weaker while still trying to smile for their son. After she passed, the promotions and projects stopped matching. Marcus had stepped away from the career path that once looked so certain because raising Jaden suddenly became the most important work in the world. He did not regret that decision, not for a second. But nights like this sometimes reminded him how much the world had shifted around them. Jaden watched his father quietly for a moment, sensing the pause. "Dad," he said gently, pointing again toward the entrance. "He is still standing there." Marcus looked up once more. Daniel Whitmore had moved slightly closer to the side wall now, allowing another group of guests to pass through the front doors without obstruction. The cold winter air slipped in each time the door opened, brushing lightly across the warm room before fading away. Marcus noticed the way the man's eyes moved across the restaurant for a brief second, not with envy but with a kind of distant observation, as if studying a room full of strangers whose lives were already full. Marcus leaned back in his chair and studied the stranger more carefully now. Something about the man's posture seemed familiar. Not the expensive coat or the calm expression, but the quiet patience underneath it. The kind of patience people learned when they had spent many evenings solving difficult problems while everyone else had already gone home. Marcus lowered his voice slightly. "Jaden," he said, "do you know who that man is?" The boy shook his head. Marcus glanced again toward the entrance. "That is Daniel Whitmore," he said quietly. Jaden blinked. "The technology company guy?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes, the one who started Whitmore Technologies." The boy looked impressed for a second, but then turned back toward his father with the same thoughtful expression he had before. "If he is so important," Jaden asked slowly, "why is nobody sitting with him?" Marcus did not answer immediately. The question was simple, but the truth behind it was complicated. In the world Marcus used to work in, Daniel Whitmore was a name spoken with respect and sometimes even a little fear. The man had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. Investors followed his decisions. Reporters quoted his speeches. But success like that often came with a quiet cost. Marcus had seen it happen to coworkers before. Late nights turned into empty weekends. Promotions slowly replaced friendships. Offices became larger while personal lives became smaller. Marcus looked down at his son again, noticing the sincerity in the boy's eyes. Jaden was not asking out of curiosity about wealth or status. He was asking because he could not understand why someone would spend the last evening of the year alone while everyone else celebrated together. The candle between them flickered again, reflecting in Jaden's eyes. Marcus finally picked up the slice of pizza and took a small bite while continuing to watch the man near the entrance. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he wiped his hands with a napkin and slowly pushed his chair back from the table just an inch. The faint sound of the chair legs brushing the floor barely noticeable beneath the restaurant's steady hum of voices and music. Marcus let the chair settle back into place as he stood, the soft scrape barely audible beneath the steady rhythm of conversation and music filling the restaurant. Jaden looked up at him with curiosity, a small question already forming in his eyes even before he spoke. Marcus rested a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Stay right here," he said quietly. "I will be back in a second." Jaden nodded, though his gaze quickly followed his father as Marcus turned toward the entrance of the restaurant. The warm glow of the chandeliers stretched across the polished floor, while servers moved carefully between tables carrying trays of sparkling drinks and small plates. Outside the tall windows, the city lights flickered like distant stars against the dark winter sky. Marcus walked calmly, not hurried, weaving between chairs and conversations until he reached the area near the host stand. Daniel Whitmore stood with the same quiet composure as before, his eyes briefly shifting toward Marcus as the man approached. For a moment Marcus said nothing. He simply lifted his hand and gave a small, respectful wave, the kind people offered when acknowledging someone across a crowded room. Daniel looked slightly surprised, glancing behind him as if checking whether the gesture might have been meant for someone else. But Marcus kept his hand raised just long enough to make it clear. Then he pointed gently toward the small table near the window where Jaden sat waiting beside the half-finished pizza. The boy noticed his father, pointing, and immediately sat up straighter, offering a bright, friendly smile in Daniel's direction even though the distance between them was nearly 20 feet. Daniel's expression shifted subtly, curiosity replacing the distant calm he had been wearing all evening. Marcus spoke in a steady voice that carried just far enough for the nearby hostess and Daniel to hear. "Sir, if you do not have a place to sit tonight, you are welcome to join us." The hostess looked startled for a moment, her eyes moving quickly between Marcus and Daniel as if trying to determine whether this invitation might somehow disrupt the careful order of reservations and seating charts. A couple standing nearby paused their conversation, turning slightly to watch. In a restaurant like this, moments rarely unfolded outside the quiet rules of formality. Yet Marcus stood there calmly, his posture relaxed, his expression sincere. Daniel Whitmore studied him for a second longer than expected. The invitation was simple, almost disarmingly so. No mention of business, no attempt to impress, no recognition of his reputation or success. Just a straightforward offer from one person to another on a winter night, when everyone else seemed to already have a place to belong. Daniel glanced briefly toward the small table by the window where Jaden now lifted his hand and gave an enthusiastic wave that mirrored the one Marcus had offered moments earlier. The boy's smile carried a kind of effortless warmth that did not recognize titles or financial rankings. For a moment, the restaurant noise seemed to soften around the edges, as if the entire room had become quietly curious about what would happen next. Marcus lowered his hand and waited patiently, not stepping closer, not pushing the invitation further. He simply stood there with the calm confidence of someone who understood that kindness did not require permission. Daniel looked once more around the crowded restaurant, taking in the glow of celebration, the laughter at each table, the countless conversations already unfolding as the final evening of the year slowly moved toward midnight. Then his gaze returned to Marcus, and for the first time that night the billionaire's expression carried something different from quiet patience. It carried the faint beginning of a smile. Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately. The faint smile that had begun to form on his face paused there, almost uncertain, as though he was deciding whether the moment unfolding in front of him was real or simply an unexpected misunderstanding. Around them the restaurant continued to move with quiet elegance. A server passed carrying a tray of sparkling glasses that chimed softly together. The front door opened again, and a rush of cold winter air slipped briefly into the warm room before fading away. The hostess near the stand straightened slightly, her professional composure returning as she stepped forward. "Sir," she said gently to Daniel, "if you would like, I can place your name on the waiting list. Something may open up later tonight." Daniel nodded politely, but did not look away from Marcus. A couple standing nearby exchanged curious glances, their conversation pausing as they watched the exchange. The idea of the founder of a billion-dollar technology company accepting a seat at a small table with strangers was clearly not something the room expected. Marcus noticed the attention but did not react to it. His posture remained calm and open, the same steady presence he carried when speaking to his son or greeting neighbors back home. The invitation had been offered without pressure, and he seemed completely comfortable letting the other man decide. Daniel shifted his gaze toward the small table by the window once more. Jaden was still sitting there with eager patience, his small hands resting near the edge of the table beside the pizza box. When he noticed Daniel looking his way again, he lifted both hands and waved with a cheerful enthusiasm that made the candlelight flicker across his face. Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it carried a hint of surprise. In boardrooms and conferences across the country, he was used to people approaching him with business proposals, investment opportunities, and carefully practiced speeches about partnerships. Yet in this moment the only thing waiting for him was a slice of pizza and a child who seemed genuinely happy to see him. Daniel glanced briefly at the crowded restaurant one more time. Every table was filled with conversations, clinking glasses, and the warm comfort of people who had already chosen who they would spend the evening with. The sound of a jazz piano drifted softly from a speaker near the bar. Somewhere in the room, someone mentioned the coming countdown to midnight. Daniel then looked back at Marcus. The man's expression had not changed. No expectation, no impatience, just a quiet offer still hanging in the air between them. For a second Daniel placed his hands into the pockets of his coat, as if considering the moment from every angle. Then he took a small step forward. The movement was simple, almost ordinary, yet it caught the attention of the nearby hostess and a few of the guests who had been watching with casual curiosity. Daniel stopped just in front of Marcus and extended his hand politely. "Daniel Whitmore," he said in a calm voice. Marcus shook his hand with an easy smile. "Marcus Reed," he replied. Daniel glanced once more toward the table where Jaden waited. The boy was now sitting on the edge of his chair with anticipation written clearly across his face. For a moment Daniel hesitated again, not out of uncertainty, but out of the quiet recognition that sometimes the most unexpected invitations carried the greatest sincerity. Finally, he nodded gently toward the table. "I hope you do not mind sharing that pizza." Daniel said with a warm tone that had not been present earlier in the evening. Marcus chuckled softly. There is always room for one more slice. And with that, Daniel Whitmore turned away from the host's stand and began walking beside Marcus toward the small table by the window where a boy waited with a smile bright enough to outshine the entire restaurant. Marcus and Daniel walked side by side through the warm glow of the restaurant, the soft hum of conversations drifting around them like gentle waves. A few guests turned their heads quietly as they passed, curious about the unusual pairing of the casually dressed single father and the well-known technology executive. But Marcus did not seem to notice the attention, and Daniel appeared equally unconcerned. Their footsteps slowed as they reached the small table near the window, where Jaden sat waiting with bright anticipation. The candle on the table flickered softly as the two men approached, reflecting in the glass window behind them where the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the winter night. Jaden straightened immediately in his chair, his face lighting up with genuine excitement. "Hi," he said with cheerful confidence as Daniel stepped closer to the table. Daniel could not help smiling at the boy's energy. "Hello there," he replied warmly. Marcus gestured toward the empty chair beside the table. "Please," he said simply. Daniel removed his coat and draped it carefully over the back of the chair before sitting down. The chair legs brushed softly against the floor as he settled in, and for a moment the three of them sat together in a small circle of candlelight, while the rest of the restaurant continued its lively celebration around them. Jaden pushed the pizza box slightly closer toward Daniel with an enthusiastic gesture. "You can have a slice," he said. "We still have plenty." Daniel looked down at the simple meal in front of him and then back at the boy. The pizza was not the elegant cuisine most tables in the restaurant were enjoying tonight, but something about the invitation made it feel far more welcoming than anything else in the room. "Thank you," Daniel said, accepting a slice. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction. The moment felt surprisingly natural, as if the three of them had simply agreed to share dinner rather than crossing the invisible lines of status that usually separated people in places like this. Outside the window, a cluster of fireworks burst faintly above the skyline, their colors reflecting across the glass before fading into the winter air. Jaden noticed them first. "Look," he said excitedly, pointing toward the sky. Daniel followed the gesture, watching the brief flashes of color. "The city always starts early," he said softly. Jaden turned back to him quickly. "Do you live here?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes. Not too far from here, actually." The boy thought about that for a moment while chewing his pizza. "Do you have kids?" he asked next with the simple curiosity that came naturally to him. Marcus glanced toward Daniel, aware that the question might feel personal, but Daniel did not appear uncomfortable. Instead, he shook his head gently. "No," he answered. Jaden tilted his head slightly. "Then who do you watch fireworks with?" The question hung in the air for a second, not awkward but honest in the way only a child could manage. Daniel looked briefly toward the window again, where the lights of the city shimmered in the distance. "Most years I watch them from my office," he said quietly. Marcus raised his eyebrows slightly, surprised. Jaden looked even more puzzled. "On New Year's Eve?" he asked. Daniel gave a small nod. "Work has a way of filling the calendar." Jaden considered that answer carefully before speaking again. "My dad says work is important," he said. "But he says people are more important." Marcus chuckled softly at that. Daniel looked at the boy again, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes, and something about the simple statement seemed to settle gently in the room. For the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore felt the strange but comforting sense that he was exactly where he needed to be. The warmth at the small table slowly settled into an easy rhythm as the restaurant continued its elegant celebration around them. The candle between them flickered gently, its soft glow reflecting against the window where the city lights shimmered like scattered diamonds across the dark sky. Jaden leaned back in his chair after finishing another slice of pizza, clearly satisfied with both the food and the unexpected company. Daniel Whitmore rested his elbows lightly on the table, holding his glass of water as he listened to the quiet conversation between father and son. For the first time that evening, the billionaire no longer looked like a man standing outside the celebration. Instead, he looked like someone rediscovering something simple that had been missing for a long time. Marcus watched Jaden wipe his hands carefully with a napkin before reaching for his drink. The small habits made Marcus smile because they reminded him of how carefully the boy tried to follow the lessons his parents had once taught together. Daniel noticed the exchange and glanced toward Marcus with curiosity. "You seem very proud of him," Daniel said calmly. Marcus nodded once. "I am." He paused briefly before continuing in a thoughtful tone. "Raising him has been the most important project of my life." Daniel smiled faintly at the word project, clearly recognizing the language of engineering in the statement. "What did you do before?" he asked. Marcus took a moment before answering, his eyes drifting toward the window where another distant flash of fireworks briefly colored the skyline. "I worked as a systems engineer," he said quietly. Daniel's expression shifted with interest. "Really?" Marcus nodded again. "Yes. Mostly infrastructure software and hardware integration." It was a long time ago now. Daniel leaned slightly forward in his chair, his curiosity growing. "Which company?" Marcus mentioned the name of a mid-sized technology firm that Daniel recognized immediately. For a brief moment, the executive's eyebrows lifted with surprise. "I know that company," Daniel said. "They produced some very solid development work a few years back." Marcus smiled modestly. "They had some talented people." Jaden looked back and forth between the two men, clearly enjoying the conversation even though much of it was far beyond his understanding. "My dad builds things," he added proudly. Daniel chuckled softly. "That sounds like a very useful skill." Marcus shook his head gently. "Not lately," he said. "Life took me in a different direction." Daniel studied Marcus carefully now, noticing the calm honesty in the man's voice. There was no bitterness there, only a quiet acceptance that sometimes the most important responsibilities could not be scheduled between meetings or quarterly reports. "You left the field?" Daniel asked. Marcus nodded. "After my wife passed away, I needed to focus on Jaden. The hours in that industry can be demanding." Jaden lowered his gaze for a moment when his mother was mentioned, but Marcus gave his shoulder a reassuring pat, and the boy smiled again. Daniel sat back slowly in his chair, absorbing the story. In his world of boardrooms and investment calls, people rarely walked away from careers because of family. They usually hired help or reorganized schedules. Yet Marcus had chosen something different without hesitation. Daniel looked down briefly at the simple table in front of him, the empty pizza box, the candle, the small napkin folded neatly beside Jaden's glass. Then he looked back at Marcus again with a thoughtful expression. "You said you worked in systems engineering," Daniel repeated. Marcus nodded. "Yes." Daniel paused for a second before speaking again, as if measuring his next words carefully. "What kind of systems?" Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair as Daniel's question settled into the small circle of candlelight between them. The restaurant around them continued its warm celebration, glasses clinking softly, quiet laughter drifting from nearby tables, and the distant hum of music weaving gently through the air. Outside the tall window, the city shimmered beneath the cold winter sky, while occasional flashes of early fireworks painted brief colors against the glass. Marcus considered the question for a moment before answering. "Mostly infrastructure systems," he said calmly. "Network stability, distributed hardware monitoring, large-scale system integration. The kind of work that keeps everything running even when nobody notices it." Daniel nodded slowly, clearly familiar with the complexity of that field. "That is not simple work," he said thoughtfully. Marcus gave a small shrug. "It can be challenging sometimes." Jaden listened quietly, his chin resting on his folded arms as he watched the two adults talk. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his curiosity growing. "Which platforms?" he asked. Marcus described a few systems and development environments he had worked with years earlier. As he spoke, something in Daniel's expression changed. The billionaire executive's attention sharpened in a way that Marcus recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who understood exactly what he was hearing. Daniel rested his fingers lightly against the edge of the table, thinking carefully for a moment. "Those systems are still widely used," he said. Marcus nodded. "I imagine they are." Daniel glanced toward Jaden briefly before speaking again. "You stepped away completely?" Marcus looked down at the table for a moment before answering. "Yes. Raising Jaden became my priority. Some choices in life are very clear when you look at them closely." Jaden lifted his head proudly when he heard his name, and Daniel could not help smiling at the boy's quiet confidence. The candle flickered softly between them as the sounds of celebration continued across the restaurant. Daniel sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. In the world he usually occupied, talent like the kind Marcus described was rarely left and used for long. Engineers who understood complex infrastructure were constantly recruited by companies across the country. Yet here Marcus sat at a small restaurant table on New Year's Eve, sharing pizza with his son and speaking about a career he had set aside without any trace of regret. Daniel tapped his fingers lightly against the table as another distant firework briefly lit the sky beyond the window. Then he looked directly at Marcus again. "Whitmore Technologies is expanding our infrastructure division next quarter," he said in a calm voice. Marcus looked up, slightly surprised by the direction of the conversation. Daniel continued, his tone thoughtful but steady. "We are building a new operations center in New Jersey. It will manage distributed systems across several states." Marcus listened quietly without interrupting. Daniel leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table. "I have spent years searching for engineers who understand systems the way you just described," he said. "People who see the structure beneath the surface instead of just the code." Jaden looked back and forth between the two men with growing curiosity, sensing that the conversation had suddenly become important. Marcus folded his hands together calmly on the table. "That is kind of you to say," he replied politely. Daniel shook his head gently. "It is not kindness. It is recognition." For a moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to soften again around their small table as the billionaire studied the man across from him with careful interest. Then Daniel Whitmore reached into the inner pocket of his coat, removed a simple business card, and placed it gently on the table beside the candlelight before speaking in a quiet but sincere voice. "Marcus, if you ever decide you would like to return to engineering, I would very much like to speak with you about joining my company." Marcus did not reach for the card immediately. The small rectangle of white rested quietly beside the candle, its clean edges glowing softly in the warm light. Around them, the restaurant continued to celebrate the final evening of the year. Glasses clinked. Someone near the bar began counting how many minutes remained before midnight. Outside the window, the skyline shimmered beneath the winter sky, while distant fireworks painted faint bursts of color across the clouds. Jaden leaned forward slightly, studying the card with open curiosity before looking up at his father. Marcus finally lifted the card and turned it over slowly between his fingers. The name Daniel Whitmore and the title beneath it were printed with calm simplicity, yet Marcus understood exactly what kind of door that small piece of paper represented. He looked back at Daniel with quiet appreciation. "That is a generous offer," Marcus said thoughtfully. Daniel shook his head gently. "It is not generosity," he replied. "It is an opportunity that should not be wasted." Marcus glanced toward Jaden, who watched the exchange with wide, attentive eyes. The boy might not fully understand the conversation, but he clearly sensed the importance of the moment. Marcus placed the card carefully beside his glass. "My priority will always be him," he said calmly. Daniel followed his gaze toward the boy and nodded with understanding. "Then you already understand leadership better than many executives I know," he said. The comment made Marcus smile faintly. Jaden leaned forward again with excitement. "Does that mean my dad can build things again?" he asked. Daniel chuckled softly. "If he wants to," he answered. The boy's grin widened as though the idea alone filled him with pride. Marcus looked down at the table again for a brief moment before lifting the card once more. "I will think about it," he said sincerely. Daniel nodded, satisfied with the answer. Neither man felt the need to rush the decision. The moment itself already carried a quiet significance. At another table across the restaurant, someone began a countdown rehearsal, their voices rising playfully as they practiced the final 10 seconds before midnight. The sound drifted through the room like a signal that the evening was approaching its turning point. Jaden suddenly pointed toward the window. Another set of fireworks burst above the skyline, brighter this time, scattering gold reflections across the glass. The boy's eyes lit up with excitement. "Look at that," he said. Marcus and Daniel both turned toward the window, watching the colors fade slowly into the dark sky above Manhattan. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. The restaurant lights glowed warmly behind them, while the city outside shimmered with anticipation for the new year that was about to begin. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the table, feeling the quiet comfort of the moment. A few hours earlier, he had stood alone near the entrance with nowhere to sit and no one expecting him. Now he found himself sharing pizza and conversation with two strangers who no longer felt like strangers at all. Marcus noticed the reflection of the fireworks in the glass, and then looked down at Jaden beside him, the boy's face glowing with excitement and wonder. In that small circle of candlelight, three people sat together at a simple table while the entire city prepared to welcome a new year. And in the quiet space between the fading fireworks and the rising countdown, something far more meaningful than business had quietly begun.